today during the day. I try not to repeat what we have heard already and go more directly into my own contribution. This is an open-ended lecture. When I sent the title, I was thinking that I would present you cases which I have been working on, which is museum and migration and representations of migration. But working on it, and especially after the first case study I present, then I got new ideas. So my talk today will be about modes of participation in contact zones and how they affect the notion of authenticity. I'll begin with giving a brief overview on forms of participation. Those who were in Hildesheim last year have heard some of it, or I had already presented these forms of participation. I'll take them up again, but go further to other forms. Then then this will be followed by some reflection on cultural heritage and the museification of cultural heritage, especially intangible cultural heritage, which is a field I have been working on lately. I present two cases. My first case is from the Norwegian Museum of Cultural History, Norsk Folkemuseum, and the reconstruction of a district called Enerhaugen, which is a district of Oslo. And my second example is from Turkey and the musealization of rituals when they become part of UNESCO's list of world's intangible cultural heritage. So let's begin with participation, because this is the new buzzword. In her book, Museums and the Public Sphere, Jennifer Barrett argues that the interaction of museums with audiences, museums ought to consider the public sphere as a broad cultural sphere, a democratic public space that engages with a varied public rather than the bourgeois elite and literary public of Habermas. An increasing number of museums of cultural history pursue today a politics of positioning and establishing themselves as authorities of recognition, advocating social cohesion in plural societies. In order to reach these goals, they have, during the last 2 decades or so, organized third spaces, where individuals and groups are given the opportunity of crossing barriers of borders, of belonging, and of sharing their knowledge, their know-how, and experiences across social and cultural divides. These third spaces serve as contact zones, if we use the expression introduced by Marie-Louise Prat and taken over by James Clifford. Not only do contact zones provide the grounds for social and cultural encounters, but they also offer an environment of reflection where people from diverse backgrounds can exchange views on the meaning and value of their heritage. Contact zones are, however, by no ways egalitarian spaces. As Robin Boast points out, there is a hierarchy in contact zones, where authority and power are still with the institution of the museum. To him, contact zones are, and I quote, asymmetric spaces of appropriation. No matter how we try to make the spaces accommodating, they remain sites where others come to perform for us, not with us, unquote. Catherine Goodnow, and this is what I already showed you last year, she distinguishes 4 forms of participation in museums. The first one is access, and it goes from the physical design with the provision of ramps, lifts, alternative maps to forms of storytelling that include films, soundscapes, like in the Quai Branly, they have braille for people who don't see well. They can read the text with their hands. The information is placed at different heights online, and also in access there is the cost ticket. How much does it cost to go to the museum? And as well as developing outreach programs. The second form is reflection. I mean, all these forms overlap, but the second she has is reflection, and it stems from a shift in the museum's perception of their changing role in society, and their need to attract diverse audiences and to retain the interest of the audiences. I mean, they want people to come back. The third is provision, and it involves community members. We have heard a lot about them, where people are asked to donate artifacts, memories, personal stories to enhance and add value to an exhibition or to make up the core program. And for museums, these provisions serve several functions. In the first case study I'll talk about, these personal stories also fill in the gap of authorized narratives and also correct the knowledge of the curators. In addition, they bring in drama, emotional effect, the sensual term that Klaus was talking about yesterday, and I mean that the interpretation is a processual all the time. Participation by provision has opened the way to structural involvement and the recognition of communities, groups, and individuals as significant contributors to the main narrative of the nation, the community, whether it is an ethnic or religious group, or a class, or foreigners. And it opens up for co-authoring, bringing in members of the community to co-author an exhibition. And there are, of course, many other levels of participation than those listed by Goodnow. Among them are those pertaining to dimensions of time and place, time and space, and the sharing of an experience, often within the frame of performance and spectatorship, which are present in the enactment of ceremonies pertaining to intangible cultural heritage. That's a point I'll come back to in my second example. Yeah. Now I'll come to intangible cultural heritage. There are, according to Simon Abudo, two main approaches to heritage in museums. One is essentialist, and it's inspired by the 1972 declaration of the UNESCO. Heritage doesn't change. It has a universal, outstanding value. And the other approach is a dialogical paradigm, and it sees material and immaterial heritage from a processual perspective. That means that one can question that heritage, renegotiate it, and bring new interpretations, and also consider its sustainability. The UNESCO has classified heritage into three distinct groups: tangible heritage, natural heritage, and from 2003, intangible cultural heritage, ICH. And this is from the Article 2 of the UNESCO Convention. It states that the intangible cultural heritage means the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith. That communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible cultural heritage is transmitted from generation to generation and is constantly being recreated, so it doesn't stand still. You can click on the UNESCO webpage and read the whole. This was not very clear about stakeholders. So in a meeting in Tokyo in 2006, the Intangible Heritage section of the UNESCO and the Asia Pacific Cultural Center added the stakeholders, and they found three groups, main groups. There were specific communities considered to form networks of people whose sense of identity or connectedness is tied to a shared history based on the practice and transmission of or engagement with their ICH. Groups of people within or across communities who share characteristics such as skills, experience, and special knowledge, and play important roles in the present and future practice, recreation, and or transmission of their intangible cultural heritage. And the third is individuals within or across communities with specific skills, knowledge, experience, or other attributes. People are the focal point of intangible cultural heritage. As I have shown you, It is mostly based on intergenerational transmission and instilled knowledge, that is, knowledge acquired by practice and experience. And this brings me to my first example. We are in Oslo. Enerhaugen was one of Oslo's, or at the time it was called Christiania, eastern suburbs. We have traces of settlements there dating back to the 13th century. And during the 18th century, it was inhabited by a few tenant farmers. And in 1815, the district was bought up by a lumber merchant, and he parceled the land and rented out parts of the parcels to poor working class families. I won't give you the figures, the census figures through the years, but anyway, Enerhaugen was considered to be a slum. It was ill-reputed, known for poverty, disease, and high level of alcoholism. Living conditions improved, however, in the 1850s and the 1880s. The majority of people lived in small one-story wooden houses. Many houses had only one room and a kitchen. If there were two rooms, different families lived in the different room. If it was same family, then let's say the grandparents in a room, the one married daughter and her family in one room. The kitchen was in common, and there were outdoor lavatories. The water pump was always situated at the corner, the crossroad at the corner of the street. In the 1930s, the municipality of Oslo decided the clearance of the district, but the project was not realized until 1959, when the old houses were pulled down and replaced in the 1960s. This is how it looked, and it was replaced by tall buildings, modern, funded by Oslo Cooperative Housing Corporation, OBOS. At the time, in the 1960s, the Norsk Folkemuseum, the Norwegian Museum of Cultural History, which is an open-air museum on the model of Skansen in Stockholm, decided to include working class and urban cultures in the museum, not only, and so they took over 5 of the houses from Enerhaugen. Once relocated at the museum, these modest houses from Enerhaugen were transformed into heritage. Basing himself on census and various sorts of documents, reports, newspaper articles, and even fiction, the curator in charge at the time reconstructed the houses and furnished them as period rooms. Thus, as was usual until the late 80s almost, he relied on his own and his peers' academic knowledge of building traditions in Norway from 1865 to 1891. And the knowledge of former inhabitants in these houses, people who had grown up in them, was considered completely irrelevant and thereby not taken into consideration during the reconstruction. The first exhibition of Innerhagen opened in 1969. And a former inhabitant of these houses said, this was not how we lived, but it was how we dreamt of living. In 2011-2012, the museum decided to renovate the exhibition and adopted a completely different perspective. And the shift went from what in Norwegian you call byggeskikk, or building practices and traditions focusing on material culture, to that of boskikk, that combines the notion of customs and practices pertaining to ways of life, how we lived. I mean, it's how ways of life and of being, and it brings then forth the intangibility of materiality, like kinship, like taste, fashion, and so on. The curators in charge concentrated on the period between 1925 and 1959, and on two adjacent houses, and in between them there was the courtyard. And these two houses were inhabited by members of the same family for 50 years, or over 50 years, until they were pulled down. And then they put an announcement on the website and said that they were going to redo the exhibition of these two houses. And they got an answer from one of the former inhabitants that they were making a mistake. The number of the house, they were saying Stupinsgata 10, and they said, no, this was not Stupinsgata 10, this was Johannesgata 4. And so they came into contact with these people who were the grandchildren. I mean, the houses were first inhabited by a couple called Marius from Oscar and Augusta from Bohuslän, so she was Swedish, and Andresen. And then they had two daughters and one son, and one of the daughters moved in the greenhouse with her family. And so these two informants were the grandchildren. Yeah, they would be the grandchildren of. And when they walked into the houses, they said, no, the house was not like that. So there came the body experience. No, this is not our house. There is a room missing. And the room missing was the entrance. I mean, the vindfang, I don't know the name in English. It's when you enter, you come into a house in Scandinavia, there is always a place to catch the wind, or the snow, or whatever. But this was inexistent in the first reconstruction. And so they had to look into the magazines, and I found that there were rests in the magazines of that vindfang. So they reconstructed according to what that man, Jörn, and his sister, older sister, who remembered much better, told them. And they had pictures. They came with the pictures. We lived like that. There was the Vinfang. There was this. And they even, the attic was inhabited by one daughter and her family. I'll show you pictures. And they found the rest of the wallpaper. So they had to order the exact copy of that wallpaper to reconstruct the attic. And that cost them much more than the family, the original family, would have ever dreamt to have spent on a wallpaper. But it had to be an exact reproduction. So tied to cultural heritage, I have a long passage on authenticity, but I don't think I have the time to go into that. But that was one thing, is also the recreation of the ambiente, what Giovanni Giovannoni calls the ambiente. That is, it could be translated by the spirit of the place. L'ambiente is, it is both a place, location, history, culture, and individual perceptions as emotions about the place are tied to that ambiente, and that is what the curators tried to do in reconstructing these two houses, which the two informants who had become the co-authors were correcting all the time how the family lived, and I found many mistakes. And here, for example, one of the informants, because this made a sort of snowball, then at the end there were 30 people who had objects that came from these places. One of the elderly men, he said, I remember sitting at table and my legs always banged into these, because he remembered, I mean, he was a boy of 4, and his body remembered. And then we have participation as also another type of participation between institutions. We have an agreement with the museum that I give a course on material culture in a globalized world, and we have an agreement with them that we go with students, and the students are there, and we were there at Innerhaugen, and then they come back, the students, with their criticism or commentaries or their small work that they have done on them. So some weeks ago when we were there, an elderly lady arrived with a friend, and she was the main informant. But she just came in and said, I'm showing my friend where I was living as a child. And immediately the atmosphere changed, because we were much more interested in listening to her. Is it correct how they have done it? Did you really live here? She became the main actor in the whole session. And there is that co-authoring and these contact zones. Where does the expert role end? Where does the amateur, is she really an amateur? She was for us the expert. And she was putting words and feelings into something we knew theoretically of our vision. she had given, and her family, pictures of the house, of the family. These are her grandparents, a cousin. That's her as a child, that's her, the family, how they looked, and they followed the fashion of the time. They were perhaps not so well off, but they were well off. They lived very nicely. And also this mysterious guy, that was one of the daughters, was married to Albert Scheinpflug, who was an Austrian, and he was a painter and a photographer, and the pictures were his. And then there is a sort of mystery there, because during the Second World War, of course, with a German name and Norway, and especially after the war, the family had to change the name, so that to retrace them was... So objects had many histories, and told us multivocal narratives. I'll jump over authenticity, because I don't think I have so much time. We can discuss it when we meet for discussion. But I'll go to my second example. These are the students. Because one of the things the students came back to all the time was, how authentic is all this? Where does authenticity stop and fiction begin? But I'll take you to Istanbul.
They don't have a wind farm there, I think.
And to the Mevlevi Lodge and Museum of the Divan Literature. Actually, it's beside, there are no Swedes here today. Yeah, you're there. It's just beside the Swedish General Consulate and the Swedish Research Institute. The Mevlevi Lodge is the lodge of the Sufi order called the Mevlevi. Just to say very shortly, or very, very shortly, but Sufism represents the philosophical and mystical dimension of Islam, and it's divided into different orders. And this is the Mevlevi Lodge. It was founded in 1491 by the grandson of the big master of this order, Jalaluddin Rumi. And they are known also, that order, popularly as the whirling dervishes. Just to say why I'm showing this, it's because in 2005, the UNESCO declared that the Mevlevi ceremony, or the Sema, where the ritual, declared it as one of the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Just to tell you about the building was founded in 1491. It underwent, you come in that door, that portal, and it underwent several restoration processes. Inside, you have the court outside, a garden. You have a cemetery. You have a clock room and the kitchen that's outside the main building. And inside you have an octagonal building, octagonal big room, a big hall, which is called the Semahane. It's the hall for the Sema ceremony, where they go around, and this is done also with there's certain sequences, musical sequences, singing and movement. It's a 3 stories house, and the ceremony is done in the center, or was done in the center, and then you sit around. But all this has become a museum, because in 1925, as part of his political reforms and the implementation of a secular state, Mustafa Kemal, also known as Atatürk, he banned the Sufi orders, and the dervish lodges were closed down. However, many practitioners kept the tradition alive in more private settings. The Galata Lodge, as it's also known as, was transformed into a primary school until the 50s, when it was closed down because it didn't fit it to be a school. And in 1975, it reopened as the Divan Literature Museum. And Divan in Arabic means a collection of poetry. Not the divan where one sits, but it's a collection of poetry. That poetry can also be a religious poetry. During the 1980s, the late 1980s, and especially during the 1990s, restrictions on the performance of in public of religious ceremonies begin to lift slightly. And there was some performance, always supervised by the authorities. And then in 2005, the UNESCO proclaimed the Mevlevi Sema ceremony of Turkey as one of the masterpieces of oral and intangible heritage of humanity. So this place closed down again and reopened as the Museum of Sufis, of the Mevlevi Lodge. So all the rooms around the central hall are transformed into exhibition rooms, where you have paintings, drawings about the ceremony. You have sort of period rooms where there are reconstructed pieces of furniture, some diorama, and also you have the ceremony is performed once a week by the dervish, who are paid by the state and the Ministry of Cultural Affairs. And the audience has to sit very still. You are not participating. Only Muslims who are there, for example, would say, "Oh Allah," or if they come and they repeat the word "Hoa," him, Hoa, 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 which means him, he, God, then you would hear that, you would recognize the Muslims because they would nod and say, Hoa, Hoa. But otherwise, you are blitz, no pictures with blitz. You just watch. So there is, in a way, a border between the spectator and the performer. The fact that it is the Turkish state that nominated the Mevlevi Sema ceremony to the list of masterpieces of humanity is an example of what Nurdan Gürbilek has described as the return of the repressed, where things returning have been transformed. What returns, what is revived, is never the same. Today, the performances are choreographed by state institutions for the benefit of tourists from various parts of the world and with different religious and ideological backgrounds. Many have lost some of their religious significance, and for many it doesn't have any religious significance, but for the performers, it might have a very strong religious significance. But, however, when you sit there and you watch, and I think even if you don't understand that, that performance affects the public. I have read the blogs of tourists who have reacted to the performance and who in a way have participated by sharing their impressions afterwards with people they don't know, and even in that frame of heritage being in a way manipulated by the state and catered by the authorities, it hasn't completely lost its affective power. So these are perhaps the presumers. I think I'll stop here.
I would suggest that we take a round of both comments and questions, both to Saphinaz and the overall topics we heard today, then make a break, and then we'll try to go into this process of, what kind of topics we have, what kind of groups might we find, and this kind. Is that okay? So that we don't make two breaks. If I may start, because we talked in private about this Ena Hogan and the amateurs coming in as an expert suddenly, and yesterday I agreed, and today I would say, isn't it more maybe amateur and expert in this specific case you presented with the two women there, and the photo was shared by her because it was taken by the brother of man,
the uncle, the husband of her aunt.
Yeah.
But these photos
Families.
were among many members of the family.
Yeah.
They were not only hers.
Yeah. I thought, well, this is much more about eyewitnessing. This is much more about eyewitnessing actually than about amateur or experts, even though we can call them, amateurs in curating, and then suddenly they become experts because they know. But they, first of all, I think they are eyewitnesses, and that might fit very well. I don't know, but that would be a question with the subject of authenticity that you haven't talked about, because eyewitnesses are known to be part of what I would call mystical or at least authoritarian authenticity.
What do you mean by that?
Authoritarian authenticity is, there are different modes of authenticity, and one of the first modes is, and the best known, is authoritarian, saying like, it was as it was, I've seen it. The eyewitness is always the one you trust the most, historically. Say like, oh, you have been in the camps, you know how it was. I'm the eyewitness, and there are, you know, social figures and social developments and processes that we're making, or that so that the eyewitness has become one of the most prominent speakers, so to say, for authoritarian authenticity. So I think there comes in another dimension, which is apart from, you know, what we talked about with the amateur and the expert.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would think we have to also put it in a. I mean, she was 8 years old when her family moved out, and her brother, who is the other eyewitness, major eyewitness, was 4. And then all the others. One of the questions the students asked, and what happens next? What happens when all these eyewitnesses, because it made a snowball, and there were many who came then to the reunions, correcting the curators and so on. What happens, what kind of story are they going to tell in 20 years? That's also another thing. I mean, you're preparing an exhibition that will last 20 years. And this, they said, we don't know yet.
I mean, they have already worked without the eyewitness, so it's very, it's interesting that, you know, while they were still available, they haven't worked as, you know, experts, and we know where the bed was, and we know where the cupboard was. So suddenly, 20 years later, eyewitnesses came in saying, no, it was like this, you know, we have the authority to speak, because we're the ones.
They were
and
given the
20 years later again,
Yeah.
they died, probably. So another legitimate sources have to come in. I mean, maybe we should talk about sources.
Yeah.
And those sources then are not eyewitnesses, but again, maybe historical documents or eyewitness accounts, video testimonies, everything that we see in Holocaust museums right now. So this is not a, you know, this is a kind of very usual, of course, problem within heritage histories.
Other questions, remarks? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Great.
You have to speak up, I believe.
Yes. Sorry. From morning to this afternoon, we've learned so many things about classification, and you have talked about contact zones, but she was a bit so saying she's not interested about that. And now, is it possible for us, Professor, to say museum can be a participatory zone? Because you've seen what Professor just presented in terms of the dance and everything. Can it be called a participatory zone or a contact zone?
First of all, I'm very into the contact zone, so there you misinterpreted me.
It's a contact zone and participatory zone. You can read because you see performers in a gathering that is very great and people are sitting and enjoying. So can we call it a participatory zone or a contact zone? And at what level does it become a contact zone or a participatory zone?
Can I ask you a question back?
Yes.
Sorry, Saphinaz.
No, it's okay, it's interesting.
Is it important to define it now, at this stage, for you? Why do you ask this question?
It is because what you gave us in the morning, I get confused whereby you say it should be a contact zone. And now I'm coming up with another thing that I was wondering, because I'm just trying to reflect it in a more broader way, whereby my professor talked about how she brought the performers in the museum.
Yeah.
As I said, can this museum be a participatory zone or a contact zone that you mentioned in the morning?
Then you go.
I think it can be both. Because, I mean, we had the children singing this afternoon, And it was a performance. He was sitting, listening, and enjoying a choir of children. In this museum in Istanbul, it's a special performance because you are going as a tourist, or if you have some Sufi tendencies and sympathies, you are going there because you know this is either an intangible world heritage. You want to, as if in other countries you would go and see the flamenco now is intangible cultural heritage. So you might go and watch a flamenco show. It has become a show.
Yeah, that's the whole destination,
Yeah.
Barbara thing that gives.
And at the same time, it has put it into a frame. It doesn't last 4 hours. It lasts 1 hour. And you pay
like
a ticket.
digestible Sufi.
And you pay a ticket. And you can buy the video. And you can watch it on YouTube. And
Cool.
so it's become a much wider. Now acupuncture has become intangible world heritage. The French meal is an intangible. The Mediterranean diet is intangible world heritage.
I'm still for making some differences and having some borders, even though this might sound traditional. But from my perspective, I mean, cultural heritage becoming, or social practices, religious practices, becoming cultural heritage, and by this being changed, is, for me at least, different from what we were talking about participatory culture. And you don't have to follow this, of course, but my offer is to say that participation and participatory culture is when the traditional role between consumer and producer, or producer and consumer, has been blurred. It's a call for action to blur this dichotomy. I don't know if this dichotomy exists, like in general, but I would say this is that there's an aspect of this make this border, more flexible. This is, for me, participatory culture. It's not, what we're doing here is not participatory culture. We're talking. And when I'm seeing the Sufi dances, the dervish dances, this is not participatory culture, even though afterwards I can go and make some comment in a book or write something on Facebook or share it with my friends. This is for me not participatory culture, because the traditional role between the visitor and the actor is very much at stake. And I'm not saying I don't like this. I like this very much. I love the theater. I love going to the theater. I don't like if the actors approach me. I just want to sit there and just watch. Get off. I don't want to. Okay. So it's not about me and what I like, but it's about saying that participatory culture, my offer would be that this blurring of the traditional borders is at least very dominant, very important.
Yeah,
Please.
Since I'm very fond of this place in Istanbul and other Sufi lodges, and I think it's interesting what you're saying. Also, I thought about that this morning, that your presentation was very much about capitalism. Right? So, cultural production has some thing that has to do with consumption, and I mean, in the traditional ritual, you participate, but there is no consumer. I mean,
you stand,
participate, and there is no production, there is no consummation, it's just being together. And here it's rather that it's gone from this pre-capitalist order into the classical visitor
division.
And, so it has producer, and you can still take part in, if you go to Fatih, other part of Istanbul, you can go for a 5-hour visit where you see the cinema, but where you need to be more of the classical way of participating without being a master. So you can't dance because you have to practice for 1,000 days, 1,001 days before you can dance. But you are still part of the traditional, not being a consumer, but being for learners. So I think that's important that from your definition, something that hasn't been a commercial thing where you buy a ticket and where you are visiting or being an audience can't become culture in that way, which is interesting that anything ritual doesn't fit in
Definitely not.
participation.
I would go even further and say participatory culture steps in when, like, you know, the kind of ritual participation is out of order. You know, if it's not normal for me to participate in a ritual like the dervish dances or other rituals, I need, you know, something because of this border. This is what I say. First, there is the dichotomy. We construct the dichotomy. Oh, you know, oh, I'm just a visitor. Oh, I have nothing to do here because, you know, I'm not a dervish. I haven't danced for 1,000 times. And then I need other forms, cultural forms that help me, or that are supposed to help me, to transgress this order that I'm making up, in a way.
But that means that by making the ceremony, the sema, into intangible world heritage, you have frozen it into a pattern, while on the original it was much freer. It was more open. I mean, you had to fast, you had to all these things, but still it was. You have put it into a frame.
That's the whole criticism towards
and museumization.
Precisely.
I mean, it is in the museum. It's become part of the program of the museum.
Yeah.
And